Welcome to our last unit on cardiovascular system. So during this module's material, we will focus on common characteristics of the blood vessels and then move on to consider more specialized adaptations on different types of vessels. This is, I believe, a great way to start. So let's remind ourselves about what we have been looking so far. As you might remember, we have already discussed about the blood, which was of course the transportation media of the cardiovascular system. And the heart, which was the pump moving this transportation media. In this chapter, we will focus on the blood vessels. And you can consider them as the tubing within which this transport media known as blood is driven forward by the pump, which was of course our heart. So the blood vessels will be the focus of this unit. You can consider these vessels as the delivery system. And we will also consider different adaptations of this tubing in a little more detail, based on the needs that we have for this tubing at the different parts of the loop that blood takes through the vasculature. Then in the coming module, where we will discuss the lymphatic system, we will see how that forms almost a complementary system to the blood vessels. We can use an analog if the blood vessels are the plumbing of the house where the clean water travels in, then the lymphatic system would be the drainage part of the house where leftover leaked dirty water goes into. But this is a discussion for the later. This delivery system of blood, so vasculature of the cardiovascular system, which we will look at in this module, that is our focus for now. And let's remind ourselves that it starts and ends at the heart. But before we get any further, let's consider briefly that why it might be important for you to know more about the blood vessels. And when I was preparing this video, I came up with many examples, and there are many more that I have not yet listed here. So we need to understand about the blood vessels in order to understand what happens in case of, for example, bleeding. So this is when we have a cut on this delivery system, and now blood escapes from it. Or in case of bruising, where there is bleeding, but it is underneath the skin, so the blood does not really leave outside the body. Or one topic which is going to be very important for us is going to be when the blood pressure is outside of the normal values, either too high or too low. And the final example that I have listed is various blockages. May they be due to cholesterol building up on the blood vessel walls or blood clots traveling in the vasculature. And these form an issue, especially when they get stuck on the narrow vessels. And of course, there could be many other examples. These were just some to highlight that it is really an important thing for us to develop an understanding of this system. By understanding more about its anatomy and physiology, we can better grasp many of its clinical implications. So there are different types of blood vessels that we will be looking at in this section. And it is typical that when we discuss these, we pretty much always want to follow the direction of the flow of the blood. So we would always start with arteries, which are the vessels leaving the heart carrying oxygen-rich blood. And of course, an exception to this would be the pulmonary circulation and the umbilical vessels of the fetus. But in general, arteries are, in all other cases, always carrying oxygenated blood. And then then we have capillaries. These are vessels with a very small diameter, and they are in close contact with the body tissues. So their role focuses on an exchange of gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, nutrients and waste products, and a lot of other things like hormones and so on. So we want to make sure that the passage of the materials in and out of the capillaries is very easy and efficient here. So there are going to be certain adaptations that we will see on these vessels that serve these functions. And then when this exchange of materials has taken place, now the blood returns back to the heart via veins. These carry blood that is typically deoxygenated, and now the blood in the veins is different in terms of the content, but also in terms of the blood pressure. And this has to be changed before blood enters the capillaries. We will talk more about that a little later. But to keep the focus on the big picture, these vessels as a whole system make a loop. Starting from the heart, going to the body parts where materials are exchanged, and ending back again to the heart. But as they would say in Home Shopping Channel, wait, there's more to that. We also have two other types of vessels that we need to know. And arterioles are, just to put simply, smaller versions of arteries. They are in between arteries and capillaries. So not quite arteries, but not quite capillaries, but something in between these. And same goes for the venules. They are larger than capillaries, but smaller than veins. So this listing that we have here, it looks now like a great list, I would say. Let's look at the general structure of a blood vessel wall here. And while the blood vessel vary depending on whether they are arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, or veins, they all, generally speaking, tend to have these same layers. And there are three layers that I want to highlight. And they are known as tunicas. And here they are: tunica intima, tunica media, and tunica externa. The last one is sometimes also known as tunica adventitia. I think that was more common, at least in the UK, where I first learned these. So just do not get too surprised if you see tunica externa and tunica adventitia being used interchangeably. We will start our study of these layers with the most innermost layer. This is known as tunica intima. One way to remember its location as the one that is close to the lumen, this is the center of the blood vessel, is to think that tunica intima is in an intimate contact with the blood that's inside the vessel. Tunica intima's walls are made of simple squamous epithelia. Do you remember what this tissue type looked like? If not, I will add a link to a video on the types of tissue at the end of this video. But if you do, well, here is a nice diagram of a cross-section of these types cells. So tunica intima's innermost layer is made of these smooth, flattened discs of a single layer in thickness. And there is a reason for it. Remember, anatomy is a result of the physiology. This single layer of thin, flat cells, it complements this layer's function to protect the vessel's other layers and to offer an easy passage of materials through this layer. Let's look at the next layer. Tunica media is the middle layer. Its walls are made of largely smooth muscle and elastin. And this tells us about its function too. Smooth muscle layer around the blood vessel allows us to control the vessel diameter through contracting or dilating. And of course, these were known as vasoconstriction, where the vessel diameter decreases as the smooth muscle layer constricts around it. And vasodilation, where the diameter increases. I do also want to mention that this is the thickest layer of these three. And then let's move on to focus on tunica externa, and also sometimes known as tunica adventitia, as I mentioned. So this layer is made of largely connective tissue, and its function is to support by reinforcing the walls and anchoring the vessel to its site. We find that a lot of nerves and even lymphatic vessels run in this layer. And while it is quite logical that these cells in tunica intima and media were able to get the nutrients and oxygen from the blood that travels within the vessel, after all, they were very close to it. Well, this outermost layer can have a little bit harder time. Now, the distance from the lumen of the vessel has grown longer before we reach the tunica externa. So what we do in case of tunica externa or adventitia, whichever term you prefer, is that we may have smaller blood vessel branches that actually nourish the vessel wall itself. These are known as vasa vasorum. So that's our three layers of the general structure of a blood vessel wall. And I have next here a rather nice diagram illustrating this. And on this diagram, please note that the three layers that we just talked about are there: tunica intima, tunica media, and tunica externa. The next thing that I would like to do is to return to this slide that we saw earlier, and I would like us to discuss it in a little greater detail of each of these types of blood vessels. And we will even include some subtypes of these. Let's start with arteries. When we talk about arteries, there are a few things that we would need to look at. But let's start by reminding ourselves that these are the vessels that arise directly from the heart. So when the heart squeezes out blood, it leaves the heart with a high pressure and in a pulsatile manner. Therefore, the walls of these blood vessels, arteries, must be adapted to this. So if you think about it, the high pressure of the blood being squashed out of the heart muscle must be tolerated by these vessels. And over the distance traveled within the vasculature before the blood reaches capillaries, which, as we will learn soon, have a thin and not as strong walls, well, this high pressure with a pulsatile flow must be evened out. So one of the functions of the arteries is to smoothen out the high pressure and especially the fluctuations over a distance before the blood gets to the capillaries. So those are some of the tasks that the arteries must be able to do. So I guess that a good question now would be that, how do we do this? Well, the arteries are typically much thicker and stronger in terms of their elastic and firm walls than, for example, what veins, for example, would be. And this can be even seen when looking at the blood vessels in a catheter or in a microscopy, as seen in these examples. Notice how the artery has a thicker and much firmer wall, which retains its shape even when the blood has left the vessel. This is shown in this picture with blue arrowheads. Look at the vessel wall on the left side of the picture. Veins, instead, shown with white arrowheads on the right of the view, are much thinner in terms of their walls, and they do not retain their shape as well, especially when emptied from the blood inside them. So this picture here is a really good demonstration of this. Now, let's return here to this slide and let's talk a little bit more about how different kinds of arteries can be classified. And this characterization is done based on the size, and by this I mean the thickness and function of the type of artery. And there are three for us to look at. Let's start with elastic arteries. These are characterized by a thick wall and a lumen that facilitates a flow of the blood by having a low resistance to it. So they are very much our conducting arteries. A good example of this type of arteries would be our aorta and its first initial branches from the aortic arch. And when we look at the wall structure of these vessels, they are characterized by having a lot of elastin in the wall. And there is little to none vasoconstriction happening on these vessels. Instead, they expand and recoil in response to the pulsatile high-pressure blood being pumped out of the heart. So they can be considered as pressure reservoirs of the vasculature. So that is a good brief summary of the elastic arteries. Let's move on. Now we will look at the muscular arteries. Muscular arteries differ from the previous ones. Let's see how. So these are sometimes referred as our distributing arteries. Remember, whereas elastic arteries were conducting, simply handling the pressure fluctuations and a high blood pressure, these muscular arteries are now going to be different from that. Muscular arteries, as being distributing arteries, can do much more. They control where the blood is directed to and where not. And they do this through having a thick, smooth muscular layer at the tunica media. And there is little elastic tissue. So a big difference to the earlier one that we saw, right? And by having this muscular wall, they are able to do vasoconstriction. This allows directing blood to or away from a certain areas of the body. So they really are in charge of the distributing where the blood goes. As an interesting note, most of the arteries that we will look at are in fact these. So we will pay particular attention to these. And now, the last type of the artery types that I want to talk about, they are actually known as arterioles. Let's see what they look like. So these are smaller in diameter of the lumen and thinner walled. Eventually, there is going to be just a single layer of tissue forming their wall. And we will see that they play an important role in forming capillary beds, controlling what flows into these capillary networks and what does not flow in. And this is done through a structure called precapillary sphincters. Notice that these are smooth muscle bands looking kind of at rings around the capillaries that branch off from the arteries. And on this figure, we can see all of them being open, allowing much of the blood to be directed to this particular capillary bed that we are shown. And on this figure, figure instead, we see pre-capillary sphincters closed in most of the parts shown here. This results the blood from being prevented from flowing into the capillary bed in question. Instead, blood flows through this area, kind of bypassing it. So that's what these pre-capillary sphincters do. So that was our arteries. Let's look at next capillaries in a little more detail. These are very small vessels, in fact so narrow in the diameter of the lumen that only about 1 red blood cell can squeeze through at a time. And another important thing to note is that the walls of these vessels are made of only tunica intima layer. So there is no media or externa in the capillaries. And there is a reason for this. The small diameter and the thin wall allow efficient exchange of the materials from and to the blood. It is interesting to note that where in the body can we find capillaries? What do you think? Well, the answer is pretty much everywhere. We find these in nearly all parts of the body, with the exception of an eye and cartilage. And their function is to allow gases, nutrients, waste products, hormones, and so on to be exchanged. So they are all about the passage of small materials and fluids across the walls. And there are 3 different types of capillaries that I want to talk about with you. Let's have a look at these. So here we have them listed, and we will start with continuous capillaries. Continuous capillaries are found especially in the skin, muscles, lungs, and central nervous system. Their walls are solid without gaps. So a term that would describe their wall well would be continuous. Fenestrated capillaries instead have these small windows known as fenestrations. Their wall looks like a Swiss cheese, if you wish. And they are especially important in organs that do filtration, absorption, or secretion. For example, kidneys, intestines, and hormone secretion. So we find small openings on the walls of this kind of capillary. And finally, sinusoidal capillaries. These are found typically in liver, bone marrow, spleen, and adrenal medulla, for example. They have huge gaps in their walls, much bigger than the fenestrations that we saw with the previous one. And by having these huge gaps in the walls of these capillaries, we are able to slow down the passage of the blood through them. And this in turn allows much more processing of the blood. So these structures with sinusoidal capillaries are often concerned with cleaning blood. So that's it with our capillaries. And now the next one that I want to talk about is our veins. Let's have a quick look at those. As you might remember, these carry blood to the heart. They have much thinner wall than arteries because there is such a low blood pressure in these vessels. And what is interesting, I think, is that these form the largest group of blood vessels in terms of the volume. So most of your blood at one time is located in the veins. So we have veins and venules, with the latter being just a smaller version of the veins. And there is one adaptation that relates to the veins that I want to especially discuss about. And this concept has to do with Venous return. Let's have a look at it a little more. So one important adaptation that we see here is that we have valves within these veins. And as you remember from our study of the heart, valves prevented the backflow of the blood. So because blood needs to return back to the heart, and sometimes against the gravity for quite a long way, say for example if you are standing up from your feet to your heart, that's a hard task. And before you propose it, no, it is not the heart that sucks the blood back in. Instead, these valves that allow the blood to return back to the heart. And this happens by skeletal muscles squeezing our veins every now and then. In fact, whenever we move a little, the veins get squashed. Remember, they have thin walls and we're not that elastic. As a result, the blood gets squashed up towards the only direction that they can go as determined by the valves. So every time that we move, we are squeezing some more blood back to the direction of the heart. And it turns out that we move all the time. For example, our respiratory movements play an important role in this. And even when you sleep, you constantly move a little. So this is what allows the blood to return back to the heart against the gravity. And what I would like to ask you to consider is that what happens when someone passes out, say, after standing knees locked for a long time, standing totally still like in a military parade? That's a good question, huh? As a hint, it can be explained through this concept of venous return and valves playing a role in the returning the blood to the heart. I am thinking that this would make a really good essay question, right? If you have no clue, we discussed this in our live weekly meeting, which you will find recorded on your resources for this week. And this brings me to a clinically relevant point that I want to highlight. What are varicose veins? Well, varicose veins, which are sometimes known here in the US as spider veins, I believe, are a result of incompetent valves. Now, as the valve above fails, the blood gets to pool up above the next valve below it, and these show up as varicose veins. These result from issues with venous return and can also have a genetic component. Some risk factors include staying in one position for a long time, obesity, or even pregnancy. About 15% of the adults here in the US are affected by this condition. Another cause that I want to mention here is the elevated blood pressure. For example, during childbirth, or when one has constipation, there might be an increased intra-abdominal pressure. As a result of these, there might be varicose in anal veins. The resulting condition is called, of course, hemorrhoids. I think that we will finish this lecture video here, and our next video we will move on towards the physiological aspects of the blood vessels. I look forward to seeing you there.